Hello, my name is Chris Clark, and I'm a beef specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I would like to visit with you today about a project recently completed through the Iowa Beef Center. This project, called the Iowa State Cow Systems Project, was funded by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. In this project, we worked with 28 cooperating herds across the state of Iowa and collected a variety of data trying to evaluate and compare 3 different systems of cow-calf production. Our goal was really to find some best management practices and keys to success to help producers be more profitable and more successful in these operations. For purposes of the project, we categorized cow-calf operations into traditional, extensive grazing, and limited grazing. The traditional systems would be the typical Midwestern cow-calf systems, where cattle graze much of the growing season and are fed stored and harvested feeds, perhaps some purchased feeds, during the winter season. Extensive grazing systems are those that graze at least 75% of the year, and limited grazing systems are those that graze no more than 25% of the year. The remainder of the year, the cattle in the limited grazing systems would be housed in some type of a confined setting, such as a building or a dry lot, and they would again be fed stored and harvested feeds such as grain, distillers, hay, and various silages. Often, mixtures of these different feedstuffs would be used to develop and feed total mixed rations. I would like to talk with you about the animal health management considerations relative to the different systems. Really, the principles of animal health are pretty consistent across these different production systems. I've listed a few points here that I consider cornerstones of any animal health management program, and I've listed vaccination, biosecurity, nutrition, identification of sick animals, appropriate medical intervention, and then management of parturition, which is the birthing process. Each system has unique challenges and opportunities, and I think it's important for producers to consider advantages and disadvantages relative to resources, skills, interests, and things like that. So when it comes to risk analysis, I think it's important to kind of compare the limited grazing systems versus the other two, so the more pasture-based grazing systems. And one of the primary differences is just a greater concentration of animals in the limited grazing systems. And so that can lead to more animal contact, greater pathogen load, more potential for calf injuries, and really a greater need for enhanced biosecurity. The grazing systems, however, are not without their own challenges. That can include greater exposure to wildlife and neighboring farm operations. It can be more difficult to check and capture, assist, and treat when those needs arise. And in grazing systems, you often have less shelter, so there may be more exposure of livestock to inclement weather. And then it can be more difficult to implement biosecurity practices in a pasture-based system. The primary disease concerns are really pretty similar across production systems as well. Gastrointestinal diseases of neonates, respiratory and clostridial diseases of growing calves, and reproductive diseases of cows are probably at the forefront of most producers' minds, regardless of system. Outside of these broad categories, there are numerous other diseases that can also affect beef cattle. I've listed a few here just as examples, such as coccidiosis, Johne's disease, foot rot, and pink eye. So on this slide, I've kind of broken it down just into 3 big categories again, listed a few infectious diseases, several causes of lameness, and then several points associated with the calving process. And I think it's important that producers stop and think about the risk in each of these categories relative to the type of system that they want to use, and then what the mitigation strategies or management strategies might be to address these risks in each of the different systems. This data goes back to the 2007-2008 USDA NAHMS cow-calf survey. NAHMS is the National Animal Health Monitoring System. And this was a producer survey, and this particular set of questions was asking a little bit about calf morbidity and mortality and causes of death and things like that. And of those calves that are born alive but die prior to 3 weeks of age, producers indicated that almost 26% of those calves died from calving-related problems, and almost 26% of those calves died from weather-related problems. 18.6% died of unknown causes, 14% died of gastrointestinal disease, 8.2% died of respiratory disease, and 6.2% died of injury or predation. Now, I would venture to guess that at least some of those unknown causes of death and some of those infectious diseases and injuries ultimately go back to calving-related problems or weather-related problems. And to me, these numbers really suggest that if we can do a good job managing the birthing process, and if we can protect those newborn calves from extreme weather, we should be able to save a tremendous number of those calves. Now, with that in mind, we might think that calving in confinement or kind of leaning toward a limited grazing system could be advantageous. But I think it's important to point out a few of the potential problems that can be associated with calving in confinement with kind of leaning toward that limited grazing system. And so I've listed here just a few references to some various surveys and studies. The first one here is from the USDA and Kansas State University, and this was a survey that concluded that calving in confinement was associated with an increased risk of being a high calf sickness herd. The second reference here is to a North Carolina State University study where they showed that cows in confinement had 1.8 times more clinical mastitis and 8 times the rate of culling for mastitis than did cows on pasture. I would guess that the main problem that led to these results would be just greater animal contact and greater pathogen load in those settings. This slide references a Norwegian dairy study from 2001 that suggests better mothering, better mother-calf bonding, and better colostrum ingestion when calving on pasture as opposed to calving in pens or in freestall barns. So the chart here kind of shows some of the data, and this column shows that a greater percentage of calves were licked off within 24 hours when calved on pasture as opposed to calving pens and freestall barns. And then this column over here shows a greater percentage of calves nursed within 24 hours when calved on pasture as opposed to those alternatives. Keep in mind this was a dairy study. They used mostly Norwegian red dairy cattle, and there's really a lack of data out there on beef cows in terms of these same kind of questions. This is not a great picture, but it does bring up some good talking points, and so I wanted to share this with you. This is at a cooperator herd. It happens to be one of our limited grazing system cooperators, and it's not easy to see, but there's a calf kind of right down in here on the feed apron, almost hidden by the back side of this feed bunk. And on this day, I visited the farm to help with collection of some feed samples and some manure samples. And this calf was born just a few minutes before I arrived. The producers did a good job, we thought, of isolating the calf, closing some gates, and making sure that the cow and calf had a chance to bond, and the calf was safe from the other cows in the barn. They do happen to calve here and house these pairs in a hoop building. So we went out and collected our samples, and when we returned, we found that the cows had managed to get some gates open, and they managed to find their way to the feed bunk, and this little calf was down in between the back legs of a few cows who were eating at the bunk. Thankfully, they were able to sort things out and get the calf out of harm's way, and he was fine, but it speaks to the risk of calf injury anytime you've got cows and calves housed in close quarters like this. You know, in a more pasture-based system, I imagine that cow would have found a way to isolate herself from the rest of the herd, probably away from the feeding area, and that calf probably would have had a lesser risk of injury by being stepped on and things like that. So that leads us to the topic of creep areas. And I think anytime we do a limited grazing system, it's important to do a creep area or a refuge area of some kind, just to give those calves an opportunity to get out of harm's way, to relax in a space where they don't have to worry about competing with adult cows. These are just some examples of creep areas that I've seen at different operations over the last few years. The one in your upper left here is more of a dry lot system, and you can see a nice creep gate right here that allows calves entry into this creep or refuge area, but obviously keeps the cows out. They've got some shelter here, they've got a nice bedded area in the back, and I believe they had feed and water in there for the calves as well. And then down here, I thought this was a really interesting take on a creep area. So the creep gates are at kind of the back wall of this hoop building, and it allows the calves to get out into this large open area. it really does a few different things. It provides a really nice space for the calves to get out and really spread out and have plenty of room for exercise, get plenty of sunshine, plenty of fresh air. If we were able to establish and maintain a stand of grass there, we could allow those calves to do some grazing. It really allows enough pen space that we can kind of decrease our animal density and then hopefully decrease our pathogen density as well. The other thing that I like about this approach is that the creep area does not take away from the pen space that's available to the adult cows. You know, I think when we design these buildings, we often kind of think about how much pen space is needed per cow or per pair. We try to make a pen that accommodates a certain number of head. And then if we have to carve out the creep area or refuge area from that pen space, we're decreasing the pen space available for adult cows. We make things that much tighter. We ultimately may have to decrease the number of cows we have in those pens. And so this is a nice way to kind of avoid that problem and just make your creep area completely outside of that building. The next topic here worth mentioning is cross-fostering, and by that I mean situations where you've got cows that allow multiple different calves to nurse, or calves that learn how to kind of rob and steal and nurse from multiple different cows. We have heard, at least anecdotally, from some of our limited grazing cooperators that they do see cross-fostering in those limited grazing systems. Good, bad, or indifferent, I guess it kind of depends on how you look at that. Some cross-fostering is probably okay, especially after those calves kind of get a little age on them, after they kind of get a good dose of colostrum, after they've bonded with mom and are going well. I think initially, though, it's really important that those calves get a healthy dose of colostrum, and really the most reasonable source, probably the best source, the most readily available source is going to be from the dam. And so I think it makes some sense initially to have some calving pens or maybe some bonding pens where we can kind of pin up those pairs until the calves get colostrum, until they've bonded a little bit, and then we can go ahead and turn them out with the rest of the cows. There are some limited grazing systems out there that do that very thing, and they'll pin up those fresh pairs for about 24 hours until they feel like the calves are really going well and like they're pretty strong and vigorous. They've had their colostrum, and then they'll go ahead and turn those pairs out with the rest of the group. So I think in any cow-calf system, one of the big health concerns or one of the big health considerations is just neonatal health. And so here we're just talking about newborn calf health, and one of the biggest diseases of concern with newborns is simply scours or neonatal diarrhea. And so we've listed here several of the organisms that can cause neonatal scours and then the approximate age at which calves are affected by some of these organisms. So you'll recognize a few of these: E. coli, rotavirus, coronavirus, and then a few others as well. When we talk about trying to prevent or manage calf scours, one of the things that we often talk about is trying to decrease the density of the calving area. So we often recommend moving from a calving lot or a calving barn out to a pasture or a stock field, perhaps a cover crop field, just to allow separation and to decrease the concentration of pathogens in that living space of the cattle. One of the ways that this is done is through something called the Sandhills Calving System. This is a system that was designed in the Sandhills of Nebraska, and it really implements the use of several different pastures, often adjacent to one another. The idea is to, about every 7 days, move remaining pregnant cows away and move them to a new clean pasture. And so you're leaving the pairs behind, moving remaining pregnant cows to a new pasture, and essentially starting over the calving process in a clean, fresh, non-contaminated calving pasture. It's a little counterintuitive in that, at least in terms of convenience and logistics, we often like to have kind of our feeding area and our observation area right there adjacent to a centralized calving area. And then once those calves are born, we like to move pairs out, perhaps moving them out to grass, putting them out to pasture. And that can work well for us in terms of just logistics. The problem with that is, especially if we get behind in turning pairs out, we can get pretty significant contamination of that entire area. And then every newborn calf is exposed to organisms that the older calves might be shedding. So the Sandhills Calving System is one that I recommend, and one of the questions that we sometimes talk about is, can we do this indoors, or can we do this in a dry lot setting? And I think there is potential to do some type of a modified Sandhills Calving System, perhaps using cleaning and rebedding as somewhat of an equivalent thing to moving to a new pasture. And so can we kind of mimic that move to a new pasture by going ahead and segregating by age, cleaning and rebedding, and trying to make that brand new calving pen for the remaining pregnant cows? Can we make that as clean as possible? This is just a schematic of what a Sandhills calving system might look like under roof. You might start out here with just a wide open calving area. Perhaps everybody is allowed to kind of commingle. We've got maybe open gates. And then as cows calve, we go ahead and start to segregate by age. The other thing that you could do is go ahead and get a head start on this by using ultrasound to get fetal ages, and then kind of segregate them even from the start of calving season by expected calving date. But ultimately here we're probably about 3.5 weeks into a calving season. And so this bottom example here is just showing that here is our current calving area, and then our 1-week-old pairs would be here, our 2-week-old pairs would be in this pen, and our 3-week-old pairs would be back in this pen. And so we've segregated those calves by age, and we're hopefully protecting these newborn calves from any pathogens and organisms that might be shed by the older calves in these other pens. It's probably worth taking just a minute to discuss bedding. We did find in the project that our totally confined herds used approximately 8 to 15 pounds of corn stalks per pair per day. I know that's kind of a big range, but that's a relatively significant amount of bedding. It's about 2 to 3 times the bedding that is used typically in deep bedded pack cattle feeding systems. And so if you kind of estimate then cost of that bedding, we priced it here at $50 per ton. That may or may not be appropriate for you, and that is a moving target, obviously. But at $50 per ton, that comes to $75 to $135 per cow per year. So not an insignificant cost just for the bedding in a limited grazing system. Finally, here we took a look at veterinary medical costs, and it's important to note that the animal health programs varied tremendously within this project, and so it makes sense that our medical costs would also vary pretty widely. So our veterinary medical costs ranged from $5 per female per year to $119 per female per year, with an average of about $42 per female per year. So here I've got it broken out by system. You can see that limited grazing systems had a veterinary medical cost of about $49 per female per year. Traditional systems had a cost of about $32 per female per year, and the extensive grazing systems had a cost of about $55 per female per year. I don't know that we've got a good handle on exactly why this is, but in our particular project, the traditional systems came in with a little lesser cost for veterinary medical care at about $32 compared to the other two systems, which are pretty comparable to one another. We also did break out these costs by herd size, and we found there was no difference in veterinary medical cost based on herd size. So again, my name's Chris Clark, and I've listed here my phone number and email address, and feel free to call or email if you have questions or if you would like to discuss this project. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen, and just thank you very much for your attention and your time.